the book of Job introduced us to the behemoth. Remember that? God created the behemoth. And we said the behemoth is the hippopotamus, right? The hippo is big and he's powerful and he's dangerous. And God said to Job, he said, I created that animal. I created that beast. And I know that he is complex. He's a complex animal. And he's different, much different from mankind. But God says to Job, listen, I created both. And if Job couldn't wrap his mind around that, if he couldn't understand the what and the how of God and his creation, then he had no right to stand before God and speak to what's fair and what's unfair. He had no right. By the way, we don't either. We don't have that right to stand before God and tell him what we think is fair and what's unfair. In fact, we don't have the right to demand fairness or question God's justice. Why? Because we're just sinners saved by grace, right? I mean, we're just sinners saved by grace. We don't want what we deserve. We don't want fairness, right? I told you last week, I don't want to go to God and say, God, give me what's fair. Because if you gave me what's fair, I'm on my way to hell. So we don't want that. So here's the point that God was making with Job. God said, Job, I am big, I'm powerful, I'm holy. Mankind is small and frail. Mankind must have holiness imputed upon him. Now, as we move into chapter 41, God introduces us to another creature, another beast of the earth. It wasn't good enough for God to speak to the hippo and just kind of contrast the hippo and mankind, but he doubles down by introducing us to Leviathan. All right, so let's pick up here in verse 1, just to give you a heads up of what I'm going to do here. Chapter 41 is 34 verses. I'm going to read them in two parts, and I'm going to basically give you an overview of what God is saying here, okay? So I really want to get to chapter 42, but I wanted to, give you an overview of what God's doing here in chapter 41. So we're going to read down to verse 11 to begin with, okay? He says, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. Never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me, God said? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. What is a Leviathan? And how does that figure into this discussion that's taking place between God and Job? Well, let's go to the Hebrew language, okay? So in the Hebrew language, the word Leviathan means to twist or to writhe. In those days, people would use the word to describe sea monsters, which were supposed to inhabit the Mediterranean Sea. In mythology, Leviathan was a many-headed monster who ruled the waters and feared absolutely nothing. It's kind of like I guess the modern version of that would be like the Loch Ness Monster, right? But the word was also used by the Jewish people to describe their enemies. However, all of this begs the question, what was God referring to when he spoke of Leviathan? Well, some people believed it to be a dragon. Others believed it to be a whale. Some others, thought it was some type of a sea monster. Some likened it to a dinosaur. But most scholars will tell you that the description that we see here in the text, and I'm going to take you through it in just a minute, best describes, anybody know? Other than Greg. This guy right here, the crocodile. That's what God's talking about. So he talks about the hippo in the previous chapter, and then he talks about this guy right here. You ever wonder what the difference is between a crocodile and an alligator? I did. Yeah, so the snout, one is squared off, the other one is longer. One lives in fresh water, one lives in salt water. Make no mistake about this. These are dangerous animals. I told the story last week to somebody, I can't remember who it was, that when we went on vacation several years ago, we stayed at a place that had, it was at the beach, and they had a huge lake there just down the road. And my wife, I didn't know it until the last day we were there, but my wife would take a walk every morning, and she would walk down to the lake, and there was an alligator in the lake. And she thought he was the cutest thing ever. And she would go and she would sit there and she would talk to him, and he would come up out of the water and you'd see his beady eyes, right? And he was big. This was no baby. For days, my wife, every day she'd walk down there and she would talk to the alligator because she thought the alligator was cute. And she thought, well, if he's aggressive and he tries to get me, I'll just run from him. He'll never catch me. Wrong answer. She told me on the last day, and I walked down there with her, and I was like, are you serious? That alligator would catch you so fast. You have no, oh no, but he's got just I said, you have no idea. That is a dangerous, dangerous animal. You guys remember Steve Irwin, crocodile hunter? I saw a video of him the other day, and he was in this protected area where they kept the alligators, and he was feeding this alligator, and he was putting some grass down so the alligator could go and nest in it. But even he couldn't make a pet out of that alligator. He was very, very cautious. God said, Job, you're not going to put a leash on an alligator and take him for a walk. We do that with our dogs, right? And some crazy people will do it with their cats. Put a leash on the cat and take a cat for a walk. You're not going to do that with an alligator. You're not going to do that with a crocodile. You know why? Because crocodiles are not domesticated animals. Notice in verse 10 where God says, no one wants to mess with a croc. You don't want to get him all stirred up because you won't be able to handle him. But then God says, he says, everything under heaven is mine. So that means God created the croc. He knows everything there is to know about the croc. And yet he, God, is more powerful than the croc. He's more powerful than God is the creator, not the created. And if Job truly understands what God is saying and his inability to challenge the crocodile, then how would Job ever challenge God? That's what God's saying. If Job is powerless against the hippo, and he's powerless against the croc, then where does that leave him compared to God? Yet God is the master. He's the one who has dominion over all things. And this is something that we should never, ever, ever forget. God is sovereign over all things, and nothing, absolutely nothing, is too difficult for him. Please remember that. And while your struggles and your trials may be difficult and even many, and maybe your answers are few, God is in control of all of it, and his grace is sufficient. Pick up in verse 12. We're going to read through the end of the chapter. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning light. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of the flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. Because of his crashings, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the threat of javelins. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. God says, on earth, there's nothing like him, which is made without fear. But he beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this particular text as God is describing the crocodile, but I did want to hit the high points of what he says. God describes both the anatomy and the nature of the croc. He says that the croc in those days was very difficult to capture. I don't imagine he's a whole lot of fun to capture today either, right? He says that his limbs are mighty. He says that his teeth are fierce. His jaws are strong. He says that his body is so powerful, he lacks fear of anything. And when he turns upstream in the water, he blows out of his nostrils, and it's likened to smoke or particles of light that is seen in the bright sun. He talks about his eyes and how they're small, how they're cat-like slits in his pupils, and they're cold. They're cold. And when they emerge out of the water, the eyes are the first thing you see, aren't they? That's what God says. Verse 25 says that when he does emerge from the water, when he begins to thrash around, that even the mighty are fearful. And then God mentions several weapons that the croc has no fear of. The sword, the spear, the dart, the javelin, the iron, arrows, and stones. He said the croc has no fear of any of those things. That he sees a weapon that's used against him as nothing but straw or stubble. Something that the croc could very easily defeat. So God says, on earth, there is nothing like him. He says he is a proud beast and he's devoid of fear. When that alligator looked up on that bank and saw my wife, he wasn't fearful of my wife. He was looking at lunch. Both the croc and the hippo are God's creation. And if mankind cannot understand the creation works of God, then mankind has no right to undermine God, his ways, or his justice. All in all, here is what God accomplished through this interaction with Job. God told Job, I'm in charge. I'm in control of my creation. Job, you're not capable of seeing things as I do. You're not capable of understanding everything that there is to know about who I am and what I've done. Therefore, Job had no right to judge God for the suffering that he had experienced. Now, let's get into chapter 42. We're only going to look at the first 6 verses. Then Job answered the Lord and he said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Remember, when we go back and we think about the one thing that Job always wanted was to defend himself. Remember? He just wanted to defend his character. He wanted to defend himself before God. But by the time God gets done with all of these rapid fire questions that we've read about in previous weeks and revealing his power in creation, at this point here in chapter 42, Job is a defeated man. He no longer seeks to take God to task. He no longer seeks to defend himself. He no longer seeks to judge the justice of God. You know why? Because he came to the realization of who he was. And he came to the realization of who God is. And that brought Job to a point where he was not only mostly silent, but he was submissive. You see, God had a plan. He had a purpose in Job's suffering. God knew what he was doing. God always knows what he's doing. And the same is true in your life and in mine. No matter how confused you might become, no matter how disillusioned you might be in the midst of your trials, listen to me. God has a plan. He has a purpose. God knows what he's doing. But are you willing to trust him? Are you willing to trust his heart when you cannot see his hand? That's what you have to ask yourself. But let me say something about all of these questions that God has asked of Job. Please understand something. Those questions were not intended to teach Job. Those questions were not intended to enlighten Job. Those questions were intended to awaken him. And this is what suffering does, isn't it? This is what trials accomplish in our lives. They awaken us to who we are and to who God is, and to new experiences and encounters with God. You know what suffering does? Suffering causes us to reflect, to respond, and to remember the goodness and the grace of God. It causes us to remember the peace that God offers us and the contentment that God offers us. It's only found in Him. So with everything that God has said to Job, Job basically makes two statements. Statement number one, I am not a smart man. I am not a smart man. Statement number two, I'm sorry. Job humbles himself and he admits that he had been wrong about God, that he had been wrong about the things that he himself, he didn't understand. And so he withdraws his accusations about God. Remember, he didn't think God had been fair. But now Job had reached the point where he was ready to accept by faith what God had allowed into his life. Job's come a long ways. He's come a long ways. He couldn't answer God's questions. But there was one thing that Job could do. He could humble himself before God. And that's what he did. Remember, anything that draws us closer to God is a good thing. And Job now understood that God was capable of anything. There was nothing that God couldn't do, and any purpose of his, God, would accomplish it. I want you to hold your place where you are, but I want you to turn ahead into Psalm 131 for just a minute. It's only a few verses there. Psalm 131. And I think this is important. Psalm 131, it's a Psalm of David. And I think that it expresses where Job finally found himself. It's where he ended up spiritually after hearing everything that God had to say. Just 3 verses here. Take a look at this. Lord, my heart is not haughty, nor my eyes lofty. Neither do I concern myself with great matters, nor with things too profound for me. Surely I have calmed and quieted my soul like a weaned child with his mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forever. You know what this psalm speaks to? It speaks to spiritual maturity. It speaks to finally getting to a place where you trust the Lord. Job accepted who he was compared to who God is. And his humility led him to maturity. He said, I'm no longer like a child. He was not like a child who was being weaned by his mother. And Job's hope in God was no longer a hope-so hope. It was a no-so hope. He had grown through this experience. He had grown through all of the suffering that he had endured. The medium of God's power could be seen in Job's pain and in his suffering. Job reached the point that a lot of people in the world today have not reached and will probably never reach. Job reached the point where he realized that the world did not revolve around him. There are a lot of entitled people on this planet that will never get that lesson. I want to make another very important point here. I want you to notice that this change that takes place in Job, his newfound maturity, was not preceded by a change in his circumstances. See, that's what happens with us sometimes. You know, we get down and discouraged or angry because we don't feel like God's been fair and we're dealing with a situation. But then when the situation changes, God makes it better, then we're all happy again. That's not what happened with Job. Yet Job had changed. He still had the same questions. He still didn't have any answers. But he had changed. He had changed about how he saw himself, and he changed about how he saw God. So he had matured despite the fact that his situation was still the same. So what's the point? Simply this: Job repented while he was still suffering. He had no idea whether or not God would one day restore his health. Let's not forget, we kind of focus on everything that he had lost, his family and all of his possessions, but let's not forget this guy is struggling physically. And he had no idea whether or not God was going to restore that. He had no idea whether or not God was going to restore all that he had lost. But you know what he does? Job fully embraces the God who allowed it all to happen. That's what he did. He embraces this God who allowed all of the things that had been taken from him and all of the suffering that he was going through. He embraced him. If that doesn't speak to your heart, I just don't even know what else to tell you. I want you to understand the lesson that Job was learning. And that lesson is found in 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17. You don't have to turn there. I'm going to read it to you. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Guys, listen, I get your trials, okay? I understand the trials and the troubles of this world and how real they are. And we can see them and we can feel them. And they oftentimes discourage us and cause us to become anxious. But know this, they are temporary. Aren't you glad? They're temporary. They're going to go away. Only those things which are eternal, those things which are spiritual will last. The Bible says that we are co-heirs with Christ. Yes, we share in his suffering, but we also share in his glory. So, what was to come was worth the affliction that Job was experiencing on earth. And while God did not answer Job's questions, the presence of God in his life was enough. Is God's presence enough for you? Is God's presence in your life in the midst of trials and tribulations, is His presence enough for you? Because that's the place we all need to find ourselves in life. Even when God doesn't answer our prayers, even when He doesn't change our situation, He has promised to be present. He has promised in His word that He is here. He is not going anywhere. He's going to walk with you. That should be good enough for us. Job said, "Now my eye sees you." Job says, "My experience with you, God, has made all the difference to me." And then he says there in verse 6, don't miss that word abhor. In the Hebrew, it means to reject or to refuse. It also means to despise. You know what Job's saying here? He says, I despise the person that I have become. I despise the person that I have been. But now by God's grace, He's changed. And the way He views His suffering has now changed. And before I close, I want to share this with you. There are 3 ways that you can handle suffering. This isn't in your notes, okay? So if you want to write these down, you can. This is not in your notes. There are 3 ways you can handle suffering. You can pray to escape it, right? You can pray to escape it. God, just take it away. You can pray to endure it. Or you can pray to enlist it. E-N-L-I-S-T. What do I mean by that? What might God do if we simply advance the interest or the purpose of God in any given situation? What might He do if we engage with Him in what He's doing? And we go to Him and we say, God, I want to see your power in my weakness, instead of simply praying for pain's removal. What might God do? And so we all have to answer this question, right? How am I going to choose to respond to suffering? How are you going to respond the next time you're in a situation where you're suffering, or you're struggling, or you're hurting, or you're discouraged, where God's allowed something into your life, you don't understand it, but you're forced to respond? Are you going to trust Him? Will you bow your heads with me?